Elizabeth Warren was mid-sentence, her voice lower than usual, carrying something raw. She spoke of the bill, of the people it was meant to serve, of the names she carried in her notes. Her hands tightened slightly on the paper. One pause stretched longer than the others, and when she continued, her voice caught, just enough for the chamber to notice. Across the dais, Senator John Kennedy didn't lean back. He leaned forward. One word left his lips. We. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The whole room froze. And the hearing was no longer about the bill, but about the answer. Like and subscribe if you think some questions are too sharp to dodge. Most hearings are built for noise. This one began to drown in its own quiet. The chamber that morning had been set for speed. Stacked agendas, pre-written talking points, and a chair determined to keep the clock from slipping. Staffers shuffled in and out with armfuls of binders, their shoes clicking across the marble like metronomes. The murmur of side conversations filled the gaps between testimony, a steady hum that said, "We've all done this before." Elizabeth Warren had taken her seat with her usual posture, straight spine, chin slightly tilted, eyes scanning the room as if measuring its temperature. She had a folder in front of her, but unlike the others on the panel, hers wasn't buried in sticky notes and tabs. It looked light. Kennedy was 3 seats down, hands folded loosely, his own stack of documents resting neatly to the side. He wasn't rifling through them. He was listening. The chair opened with routine procedure, motion acknowledgments, record entries, quick summaries of what was to be covered. It was all ordinary until Warren began speaking. She didn't launch into statistics right away. Instead, she painted a picture. A small-town family blindsided by medical bills, a veteran navigating a benefits maze, a single mother denied housing assistance. Each example was wrapped around the same theme, the urgency of passing the bill on the table. But somewhere in the telling, the cadence shifted. The room seemed to lean in without realizing it. The shuffle of papers slowed. Even the photographers, who usually captured 2 shots and moved on, kept their lenses trained on her. It wasn't just what she was saying, it was how. There was no rush to her sentencing, no bullet point march toward an inevitable conclusion. Instead, her words carried weight, not the weight of policy but of memory. Kennedy didn't move. He had seen hearings pivot before, but this wasn't the kind of pivot driven by strategy. This was something else, something more personal. The chair glanced at the clock but didn't interrupt. The hum of the room had vanished. The hearing, built for noise, had slipped into silence, and no one seemed ready to break it. Numbers can be debated, stories can be dismissed, but a voice breaking, that lands different. The bill in question was already thick with edits, a blend of bipartisan concessions, lobbyist fingerprints, and last-minute adjustments to satisfy committee heads. On paper, it read like every other piece of legislation, dense, dry, and padded with clauses no one outside the room would ever read. But Warren wasn't reading from the bill, she was reading into it. She began with its origin, not in a committee office or a policy think tank, but in a letter she'd received nearly a year ago. It had come from a retired school teacher in rural Maine, written in cursive, the paper folded twice and sealed with tape because she'd run out of envelopes. The woman had been evicted after her landlord sold the building to a developer. Her pension covered just enough of her groceries and heating oil, but not the deposit on a new apartment. She'd been sleeping in her car when winter came. By spring, pneumonia had set in. Warren's tone was steady at first, her voice like a flat plane stretching for miles. She recited the timeline as though she were building a case, but then she reached the line in the letter where the woman apologized for being a burden to her community. That's where it happened. The first crack. It wasn't a sorrow or a pause so long the chair had to prompt her. It was a small, almost imperceptible tremor that slipped into the space between 2 words. The kind that passes before you realize it's there, but lingers in the ear long after. Kennedy's eyes narrowed, not in skepticism, but in attention. He had heard political theater before, scripted emotion, manufactured outrage. This wasn't that. The panel remained still, some shifting in their seats, others staring at their notes as if unsure whether to look at her. Even the stenographer's keystrokes seemed to slow. Warren pressed on, moving from the teacher's story to the broader point, that the bill was an abstract policy. It was a lifeline. Every delay, she said, was measured not in days on a calendar, but in lives disrupted and sometimes lost. The chair let her run long. No one interrupted. Kennedy still hadn't spoken, but that wasn't going to last. Some senators jump in to disrupt. Kennedy waits for the point where one question will do more than 10 speeches. Warren reached for her water, not to buy time, but because she'd been talking for nearly 8 uninterrupted minutes. She set the glass down slowly, her hand hovering for half a beat before pulling away. That's when Kennedy leaned forward. Not aggressively, not with the raised eyebrow he sometimes used when dismantling a weak argument. This time he moved with the caution of someone about to handle something fragile. "Senator Warren," he began, his voice low enough to make the microphones lean in. "I want to be sure I understand." She looked over, brows knitting slightly. Half invitation, half wariness. "You've shared a story," he said, gesturing toward her notes, "and you've tied it to this bill. You've spoken about urgency, about lives changed or lost, depending on what we do here." A few members shifted in their seats, already bracing for a combative turn. But Kennedy didn't go there. Not yet. "My question is this," he said, pausing just long enough for every pen in the room to hover midair. "Why?" The word hung there, weightless at first, then heavy as it settled. Warren blinked, thrown for a fraction of a second. "Why, what?" she asked. "Why this bill? Why now? Why this version with these compromises instead of another that might do more for the very people you're talking about?" It wasn't a trap, it was an opening. But it was also a pivot, one that forced her from storytelling into defense. She sat back slightly, her hand curling over the edge of her folder. "This bill," she began carefully, "isn't perfect, but it's the one that can pass. It's the one that gets us moving forward instead of—" Kennedy interrupted, gently but firmly. "So the answer is because it's what's possible, not necessarily what's best." The chair's eyes darted between them, sensing the temperature in the room rising. Warren didn't answer immediately, and in that pause, every camera in the chamber found them both. It wasn't the question itself that split the room, it was the silence that followed it. The pause after Kennedy's words wasn't long, but in a place where seconds are measured in political risk, it felt like an eternity. Warren's eyes moved away from him, landing briefly on the chair, then on the row of reporters along the back wall. She knew, as did Kennedy, that this wasn't just a hearing anymore. It was a live segment. Every hesitation, every shift in tone would be clipped, captioned, and looped on social media before the afternoon was over. On the left side of the dais, 2 Democratic senators leaned back in their chairs, arms crossing in unison. They weren't about to step in, but the message was clear. They were with Warren. On the right, a quiet murmur passed between 2 Republicans, both glancing toward Kennedy with the faintest hint of approval. They weren't just watching a question land. They were watching a pressure point get exposed. Warren finally spoke. "Senator, what's possible is what's best when the alternative is nothing." It was a sharp recovery, one that drew nods from her side of the aisle, but Kennedy didn't flinch. "Then let's be clear for the record," he replied. "You're saying the bill leaves some people behind, but you'll accept that cost for the sake of passing something?" The chair shifted uncomfortably. Reporters scribbled faster. You could feel the air in the room dividing, half of it rallying behind Warren's pragmatism, the other half hearing Kennedy say out loud what they suspected she didn't want in the transcript. A cough from the gallery broke the quiet. One of the aides near the back whispered something to another, and a ripple of reaction moved through the press row. Even before the exchange was finished, people were already picking their clips, and as Warren leaned back to steady herself, Kennedy stayed where he was, still leaning in, still watching. And leadership wanted the exchange to end. Kennedy made sure it didn't. The chair cleared their throat. "We need to stay on the schedule," they said, the kind of gentle reminder that isn't really a request. Staffers at the side table began shuffling papers, a signal to move to the next item. Warren straightened, ready to pivot back to her prepared points. Her hand reached for the binder, the one with color-coded tabs, where the rest of her testimony sat untouched. But Kennedy wasn't finished. "Madam Chair," he said without breaking eye contact with Warren, I have one more question for the senator. The chair hesitated, measuring the political cost of denying him the floor. Finally, they gave a curt nod. Make it quick. Kennedy's voice dropped a notch, just enough to draw the room back into that tight, narrow focus. Senator Warren, in your view, is this bill the best we can do or the best we're willing to do? It was a subtle shift in language, but the weight of it landed like a hammer. Warren's mouth opened, then closed again. She glanced toward the chair, toward the cameras, and then back to Kennedy. That's a false choice, she said. Then answer it anyway, Kennedy replied. Gasps and murmurs rolled through the chamber. Some on her side bristled, others sat perfectly still, realizing the trap had already been sprung. If she said best we can do, it implied she'd given up on pushing further. If she said best we're willing to do, it meant admitting politics had capped her ambition. Her jaw tightened. We are doing what is possible now, she said finally, enunciating each word as if locking a door behind her. Kennedy leaned back slowly, not in triumph, but as if filing the answer away for later. The chair seized the opening. Thank you, Senator. We'll move on. But the spell of the moment didn't lift. Reporters had the clip, the staffers had the soundbite, and Warren knew the question would follow her long after the hearing ended. Inside the chamber, it was a tense exchange. Outside, it became something else entirely. The gavel hadn't even struck before the first notifications started lighting up phones. A junior staffer for a rival senator had clipped the exchange, trimmed it to 26 seconds, and pushed it to Twitter with the caption, Warren pauses. Kennedy doesn't. By the time Warren was halfway down the hallway, the video was already climbing the trending list. On one split screen, cable news anchors replayed the moment in slow motion, zooming in on her hesitation. On another, a political podcast froze the frame right as Kennedy leaned in, analyzing the shift in body language like it was game tape from the Super Bowl. The headlines didn't agree on what it meant, but they all agreed on one thing. This was the moment from the hearing. Progressive outlets framed it as Warren stands her ground against loaded question. Conservative blogs went with Kennedy corners Warren on compromised politics. Even late-night comedy shows picked it up, looping her pause with a punchline. Back in the committee's private workspace, phones kept buzzing. Some aides told Warren it would blow over. Others warned it was already cementing a narrative she'd been fighting against for months, that she was willing to settle for less. Kennedy didn't do a media tour. He didn't post the clip himself. He didn't have to. The footage was everywhere, and his question, all one syllable of it, was now the title of 1,000 opinion pieces. By evening, even people who hadn't followed the bill were asking, did you see that Kennedy-Warren thing? And that's when the hearing stopped being about legislation. It had become a story about the moment politics broke through the noise and refused to leave quietly. Some exchanges fade after the cameras go dark. This one stayed lit. 3 days later, Warren was in a Boston radio studio fielding questions about housing policy when the host pivoted. Before we wrap, he said casually, can I just ask, why? The tone was playful, but the subtext wasn't. She knew exactly what he meant. In a town hall the next week, a constituent brought it up during the Q&A. Not angrily, not even politically, just curious. Senator, why that bill? Why not fight for more? Even friendly interviewers started slipping it in, sometimes smiling as they asked, sometimes not. The single word Kennedy had dropped into that hearing had become a shadow, light enough to carry everywhere, heavy enough to weigh on every answer. And Kennedy? He never repeated it, never framed it as a victory. He didn't have to. The power of the moment was that it belonged to the public now. In Washington, questions often get answered and forgotten. This one had been asked once and kept echoing. If one word can change the direction of a debate, what word would you choose? Tell us in the comments.